The other day, just for giggles, I decided to look up what folks deem to be the worst books ever written. This, of course, led to a variety of results, one of which being a personal favorite website of mine, Goodreads. Of course, there's lists on Wikipedia and other places, but for the beginning of this year Vidster, I'm just going to focus on the Goodreads list. As I scrolled through the list of books Goodreads users considered the worst, I saw some which really jumped out at me. In almost every single list can be found things like the Twilight Saga or 50 Shades of Grey, but some other titles that stood out to me were fairly popular novels, some of which I've read and really, liked. Of course, some of you might hate some of the books I'm about to list that I like, but that's a part of the video I'll get to in a moment. But here were a few surprises that I found in one list. The Shack, The Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird, Animal Farm, The Red Badge of Courage, Fahrenheit 451, Lord of the Flies, Atlas Shrugged, Anthem, 1984, Brave New World, Ulysses. All of these books were just on the first page of a list which includes over 1,000 books. I chose to mention these ones either because they're books which I've read and appreciate, or because they're generally understood to be classics, which is also the case for many of the books I've read that I just mentioned. Some of these titles really slapped me in the face because they're works that continue to be great freaking books. Lord of the Flies and Brave New World are among my favorite novels. To Kill a Mockingbird is one of the most influential novels in the history of maybe ever, at least if you live in America, which had slaves. Most countries had slaves, but this of course does not mean that it's good, but I think it's pretty okay. Certainly not one of the worst books ever. Now, I mentioned that all these books are classics. This is important because they're in the same list of bad books as such works as Twilight, 50 Shades of Grey, Miles to Go by Miley Cyrus, Guilty, Liberal Victims in Their Assault on America by Ann Coulter, The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. I don't need to list more because you get the idea. This person listed a lot of political books, both left and right, Scientology works by L. Ron Hubbard, Hannah Montana books by Miley Cyrus, Stephanie Meyer novels, E.L. James novels, etc. In short, the things you would expect to find on a worst books list. But from scrolling through this person's list of the worst books of all time and seeing the weird variety of books I felt were awful, I found myself wondering, what exactly makes this person think these books are bad? And furthermore, what do I think makes a book bad? Upon looking into it further, I discovered that this list is an aggregation of votes Goodreads users cast to decide on what the worst books were. This, however, is irrelevant, as the point of this video is not to discuss the list itself, but only what it made me think of. The standards in a list like this are clearly either flimsy or non-existent, and this fact made me think about what my own standards are. If you were to ask me what some of the worst films of all time were, I could list 10 off. Easily. If you were to ask me what makes a film bad, I could describe it easily. It's something I've thought about a lot. But I've recently discovered that judging books is a whole lot harder. I think this is important because I had an existential crisis thinking about this. If I don't know what makes a book bad, then how am I supposed to know what makes a book good? Of course, I've always had a vague idea of what I think makes a book bad. There have been books I did not like and thought were essentially garbage. But what I noticed upon thinking about this is that, unlike with films, I can't just conjure up a blanket definition of a bad book. I'm only ever faced with thinking about bad books when I read one and it slaps me in the face. I realize that I said a lot that amounts to saying nothing, but I'll try to explain myself as I go on. Essentially, books and reading lead to a much more intimate experience than watching a film. You can watch a movie by yourself, yeah, but I would argue that there's a form of mediation there which doesn't exist when you sit down alone on a snowy night and munch on some fat literature. Because of this, each reader is going to have a wildly different experience with the work than every other reader. Whereas a theater full of people likely all come away having had a similar or identical experience. This is not to say that they will all have the same thoughts about the movie, just that they all had the same experience. A novel, on the other hand, creates a different experience for every reader just in the nature of its own existence, and in the setting or increments a reader experiences that work of writing. I think this is partly why judging a piece of writing as good or bad is so much more difficult than judging a film as good or bad. So, to develop this idea of what is bad writing a little further, I reached out to some of my friends, family, and professors and got their opinions on what makes a book bad. I got a wide variety of responses and answers, so here are some of them. Okay, so just for some info for all of you, I took this poll on Instagram, so I'll be reading responses from there. And my question was, readers, what do you think makes a book bad? Please give book example. This first response I got was, they leave a hangover and don't make a second book. This person said, can't connect to it. This is a point that I'll respond to later on, but basically, I think this is a pretty valid point. but I won't talk too much about it now. I'll expand on it. I've got a whole section of the video dedicated to not being able to connect to a text later on, but good response. Good on you. This person said, an undecipherable plot. They spelled decipherable wrong, but their heart's in the right place. Now, this is interesting because this brings into the question of what constitutes undecipherable. For instance, you can make the case that a lot of Ernest Hemingway works are undecipherable. For instance, Hills Like White Elephants. The plot of that at a surface level is undecipherable, sure, but there's a lot more going on beneath the prose, like within Hemingway's whole iceberg thing, which makes the plot decipherable if you know the tool to use it. So I don't think that undecipherable necessarily means that something is bad. It can. There are plots that are incohesive and nonsensical and, yeah, undecipherable. And that's a case where that'd be a valid criticism. The reason I try to steer away from responses like this or criticism like this is because they're so vague and can lead to really bad criticism sometimes. Like, for instance, Hills Like White Elephants. Do I think Hills Like White Elephants is a masterpiece of writing? Not really. I think it's a little overrated, but the basic principle there of using as few words as possible and removing the words to connect to a human experience or to make the reader come up with the plot is, I think, really powerful. Or for instance, the Hemingway 6-word story of For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. There's not really a plot there. You can make the case that's not a story, but you could also make the case that there's a huge plot and that there's tons of stories from that. And yet there's not really like a decipherable, clear, singular plot or story. So that's kind of my response to that one. When it does too much of the work for you, To Kill a Mockingbird was an example here. Don't exactly know what this person's referring to, maybe in terms of like theme or idea. Maybe it beats you over the head and doesn't give you enough room to decipher. I think that's also perfectly valid. There's plenty of books that I read recently where I felt that was a negative. For instance, I just read The Roundhouse by Louis Erdrich. I thought it was a pretty good book, but there were sections in it where I made an inference that I thought was pretty clever on the part of the author Erdrich for, setting up the clues or steps to that, and I figured it out, and I was like, wow, this is pretty good, deep writing, and I'm also proud of myself for figuring it out. But then she literally stated it a couple paragraphs later, and I didn't think it was necessary. Stephen King's been doing this in his most recent books as well. For instance, in The Institute, there's a section when we first meet the character. I think his name was Tim. I don't know. I hated the book. He's on an airplane. He mentions that he doesn't like it. He wants to get off. He feels claustrophobic. A few chapters later, he's stuck in traffic in a car, and he mentions that he starts to feel claustrophobic again. So I thought, just like on the plane, this guy clearly doesn't like small spaces. And then a few sentences later, the book said, yeah, he's beginning to feel claustrophobic, just like on the plane. He did not like enclosed spaces. And I said, okay, thanks. So I think that's valid. Again, this is kind of vague and difficult to pinpoint as actual valid criticism, but I'll go with this one. I feel you. Over-reliance on world building without interesting characters to back. Example, The Way of Kings. Yeah, this is a good one. I'm not a fantasy expert, and I'm going to sound like a bit of a dick here, but for me, one of the clearest examples or indicators of a bad writer is just going straight for fantasy and using all these weird fantasy terms and fake names and made up words and places. No, that doesn't work. You have to have characters that go along with it. For instance, I'm currently working on my university's literary magazine, which goes over submissions from students, and there was a fantasy story in it that was completely atrocious, and this is a perfect example. It tried to world build and have lore and make its world intriguing, but the characters are the most flat, boring cardboard cutouts that you could have possibly put in a work. This is, again, will sound pretentious, but I think that fantasy is the go-to for bad male writers, especially younger guys who are just getting into writing, because it's probably what they've read the most of. So they know how the language and the diction works, but they don't quite have the ability to flesh out those characters. And they think that what they like is the world of fantasy, when really what they like is the characters. You see this in things like Harry Potter and Star Wars as well. What's interesting about Harry Potter and Star Wars or Game of Thrones is not the world, but the characters. And writing good characters is the hardest thing that a writer can do, and is what makes writing a special talent. And world building, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's a hell of a lot easier than writing characters. And so I definitely think this is a perfectly valid criticism. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later in the video as well. Having to put a lot of work into understanding what the book is saying, like Shakespeare. Okay, hang on, let me get my middle part out of my face. This is another tough one. I will absolutely agree that reading something you don't understand is not fun at all. I've worked with kids and students who don't like reading a book because they can't understand it. That doesn't mean that the book is bad though. For instance, right now, I'm struggling to read Ulysses by James Joyce. I don't understand 50% of the dialogue or what's going on in that book because it's references to things that I don't understand. It's in other languages. They're anachronistic references. Basically, I'm just too stupid to read the book. And it'd be unfair for me to say that the book is bad because I don't understand it and I don't understand those references. This is tricky because if you don't like or aren't willing to put in the work to understand something, of course you're not going to enjoy reading it or want to read it. And in that case, I say stay clear of things you think you might not be able to understand. Or if you get there's something that you just don't get, put the book down and accept, I don't understand this. But recognize that for people who do understand it, it's probably not a bad book. Like Ulysses. Am I going to say it's the greatest novel ever written? No, okay, I don't like it that much. But this is a book that has had a huge influence. It's been read many times. It's been a huge impact to change literature forever. And to simply call it bad because I don't understand it would be unfair. The same with Shakespeare. Recognize also that Shakespeare was writing 400 years ago, give or take. And the words and terms and sentences he was using for his time made perfect sense and were easy to connect to. And the issue we have now is not Shakespeare's fault, it's because we don't speak that way. We just have to sort of understand what he's trying to say. And when you get what Shakespeare is saying, it's pretty profound and I think really effective and great writing. So yeah, putting in work to read something is not enjoyable, and this is a concept I'll talk more about later, but enjoying something and recognizing its quality are not the same thing. And this is something in criticism that I try to stress over and over and over again. I try to talk about this in my classes with my classmates, with students I work with. This is a huge thing and not a lot of people get it. And I think it's really important that we keep talking about this and working on it. This person said, having to read. Okay, you got me there. This guy said, if it isn't by Steve King. Yeah, okay. This person said, pseudo-intellectual writing style, cough, Dan Brown, cough. Yeah, that's definitely another trademark of bad writing is when someone thinks that the writing is really smart or really good or really awesome, but it's actually just mediocre trash. A lot of people like Dan Brown. I've never touched a Dan Brown book. A lot of people really don't like Dan Brown. I don't know what to say about that one, but yeah, good criticism. This person said endings, and I remember that I reached out to them because I didn't understand what they meant, and they talked about how sometimes endings are unsatisfying or they're left wanting more. And this is a whole video, so I won't get too far into it, but in the instance of ambiguous endings, I don't think it's fair to say that a book is bad because it's ambiguous. I think you can have a shitty ambiguous ending, yeah. And you can also have an ending that is just not satisfactory, like Game of Thrones. So endings, yeah, I can see that. You could have given me more, man. Come on, we both know it. Okay, yeah, so those are all the responses I got. There were some pretty good ones, some interesting ones, and this was a server that I had a lot of fun with, and I think I gleaned a lot from it. I discussed this in one of my classes with one of my professors, and it's a really interesting conversation that I'm glad I had, and I hope that it made the video a little bit more different and interesting than usual. I'm not quite done yet, though, so don't you stop watching this video. Don't do that. But a common thread that I noticed were people who felt they couldn't connect to a text, either because the work was too dense, like Shakespeare, or for some other reason. I think this is a great idea to consider a book bad, as I mentioned, especially given what I said earlier in the video about reading being such an intimate experience. If the book you're reading doesn't connect to you, then that experience is not intimate, or special, or good in any way. And thus the book is failing on its most basic level, hence making it a technically bad book. But here we run into another problem. Say a book connects with one person but not the next. Does that make the book bad? What are the reasons it doesn't connect with someone? Is it fair to call something by Shakespeare bad just because not everyone can readily understand it? I talked about this a bit already, but in my first video ever, I talked about a concept in film criticism which I call the separation of recognizing quality and personal enjoyment. The same basic idea connects to novels as well. I think it is possible to not have a text speak to you personally, thus making it difficult to enjoy, but that you can still recognize the work's literary merit. Of course, this in itself presents problems and contradictions. Some readers may judge a book's quality exclusively in how it connects them, but I don't think that's entirely fair. I will also say that there are always going to be instances where readers just aren't able to get books at certain points in their lives. I know this sounds pretentious, but I don't mean it to. I've seen examples of this even with myself. For instance, when I was in 8th grade, my English class had to read The Pearl by John Steinbeck. I hated this book, and even then I was a voracious reader. The only thing I can really remember about not liking the book was that it was supposedly boring and pointless. John Steinbeck has gone on to become one of my favorite authors, and if I haven't reread The Pearl yet, I'm sure I would have a different opinion on it because 8th graders, especially one as dumb as I was, have no business being forced to read, let alone appreciate John Steinbeck books. My point here is that if someone reads something, doesn't understand it, or thinks it's confusing, that does not mean that they should write the book off as bad. Instead, they should consider what they might not understand, why it didn't connect with them, and think of ways that can enhance their own understanding or connection to the work. This may be as simple as putting it aside and coming back to it in a few years. Another example I've personally encountered where this worked in my favor was in my first reading of It by Stephen King. As a 13 or 14-year-old when I first read it, I didn't really see what all the hype was about. I didn't quite understand the book. But when I reread it just before graduating high school a few years later, the book's ideas about growing up and the pains of childhood and lost friends and all that really hit home with me more than it had before, and I enjoyed the book quite a bit more than it previously had. And even now, 3 years after that, reading passages and parts of the book make much more of an impact on me now than they did during my last reading. So this was an incident where the text was just beyond me as my first reading, and me calling it bad would have been unfair because I was actually the one who was bad. I'm not trying to say that there is no such thing as having a valid criticism against a book, or that every time someone dislikes a book, it's because the work is beyond them. There are countless books that are deserving of harsh criticism due to poor writing, or pacing, or character, whatever. While on the subject, though, I should also point out that this is why some people may consider one work brilliant, while others may consider it nonsense. But anyway, what really makes a book bad? There is no one answer. The answers all of my accomplices in life gave are answers. But in doing some research for this, I came across a book by the title of Atlanta Nights, which is considered one of the worst books ever written, if not the worst book ever written. Atlanta Nights, however, is a book which was intentionally written to be bad. Long story short, someone got a group of fantasy and sci-fi writers together, gave them each chapter prompts, and had them each write their chapters without communicating with each other at all. What this resulted in was a book riddled with inconsistencies, riddled with characters who die and come back to life, change races, change names, plot points which go nowhere, things like that. This is an example of a book which is inarguably bad. This is a work which is a textbook example of bad, but books are rarely ever that cut and dry. Take The Eye of Argon, for example, which is often considered one of the worst fantasy novellas ever. The prose is trying far too hard and is as purple as prose can be, but I'm hesitant to call it simply bad, given that it was written by a 16-year-old kid who clearly had a talent for stringing sentences together, but just didn't know when to ease off the gas pedal. Here's a passage, for example. With a sloshing plop, the thing fell to the ground, evaporating in a thick scarlet cloud until it retained its original size. It remained thus for a moment as the puckered maw took the shape of a protruding red eyeball, the pupil of which seemed to unravel before it the tale of creation. How a shapeless mass slithered from the quagmires of the stigmatic pool of time, only to degenerate into a leprosy of avaricious lust. In that fleeting moment, the grim mystery of life was revealed before Gringner's ensnared gaze. So again, this is fairly impressive prose for a kid, and clearly full of heart. The problem is that it's so over the top for the entirety of the novel, and when the entire work is written this way, there is no poignancy or clever showing off of one's writing ability, but only a semi-comical overindulgence of oneself lacking any sort of subtlety or nuance. This is sort of like the pseudo-intellectual style of writing one of my friends mentioned in their answers, right? So this is writing that is bad in a sense, but not simply bad as something like Atlanta Nights is bad. However, I do think this is a good look at one-way writing can indeed be bad, if not horrendous. More often than not, though, it's fuzzier than that. Books have unfocused narratives, poorly paced, half-done characters, and things like that, all of which are the same problems films struggle with. The difference, though, as I mentioned, is that all words look the same on the page, and putting them together in a unique way almost always hinges on the reader. Because of this vagueness, it's harder to pinpoint things like pacing and structure in a novel and in films. So, in conclusion, there's a lot of things which can make a book bad, and no one answer to my overall question. Every reader is going to have an opinion on what makes a book bad, and in turn, what makes a book good. These are just some of my thoughts, but you better believe that I'll be talking about specific bad books in future videos to coincide with this one. Maybe. So, Thank you for watching, and be sure to let me know what you think are some bad books or what makes a book bad in the comments below. Yeehaw.